Some lives seem destined for noise. Others begin in silence and spend years learning how to break it. Mariska Veres was born into a world where music was not a dream, but a discipline. Her father was a gifted violinist, a man who treated sound like work and beauty like responsibility. In their home, music was not something you discovered, it was something you were assigned. From early childhood, Mariska and her sisters were placed at the piano, not as children, but as apprentices. Hours passed, then more hours. Mistakes were not part of the process, they were something to be corrected. For most of the girls, music slowly became a burden, something heavy, something to escape. But Mariska reacted differently. The pressure did not soften her, it shaped her. Somewhere inside that strict routine, something hardened, and at the same time, something quietly began to wait. She did not grow up dreaming of stages or applause. She grew up learning endurance, learning how to sit still, how to repeat, how to survive inside expectations that were never hers. And yet, everything changed the day she stood in front of a microphone. For the first time, sound was not something she had to obey, it was something that obeyed her. When she sang, her family understood immediately. This was different. This was not training, this was instinct. Her father saw opportunity, a practical one, a father and daughter performing in restaurants, a way to turn talent into income. But Mariska had already begun to listen to a different world. The radio became her real school. She copied voices, bent melodies, searched for colors that felt truer than normal speech. School slowly faded into the background, and without quite realizing it, she was already leaving childhood behind. By the time Mariska was 16, she was no longer preparing for life, she was already inside it. Europe in the early 1960s was changing its sound. The Beatles had arrived, and suddenly every street seemed to grow its own band. The Hague was overflowing with young musicians trying to imitate a miracle that had come from across the sea. In that crowded noise, a young singer with a strange, dark voice did not stay invisible for long. Mariska's first real step onto a stage came with a small group called Les Mystères. It was not a dream beginning. The shows were modest, the ambitions still uncertain, but for the first time, she was no longer practicing music, she was living inside it. The band even managed to save enough to record a tiny album pressed in almost symbolic numbers. It sounded rough, sometimes uneven, but it captured something more important, a voice still in the process of becoming itself. That record quietly closed one chapter and opened another. Soon after, she was invited to join a more established group, the Bumblebees. The venues were bigger, the rehearsals more serious, the expectations higher. And slowly, without ever planning it, Mariska began to build a name inside the Dutch scene.
She moved from band to band, from stage to stage. Blue Fighters, Danny and his favorites, General 4. Each project left something behind, a little more confidence, a little more control, a little more distance from the girl who once sat silently at a piano. She even recorded a few solo singles. None of them changed her life, but they taught her something more important, how to stand alone in front of a microphone and not disappear. By the late 1960s, she was no longer a beginner, she was a presence, and yet the world around her was starting to feel very small. She had reached the edge of what the Netherlands could offer, and she could feel it, even if she didn't yet know what would come next. There are moments that only look small when you are standing inside them. In 1968, the Bumblebees were invited to perform at a party celebrating another band's success. It was the kind of event that usually disappeared from memory the next morning, but that night, several members of Shocking Blue happened to be in the room. They had already released one album. It had failed. Their future was uncertain. Mariska sang, and something in the room shifted. Her voice did not sound like the other Dutch singers of the time. It was darker, colder, and at the same time strangely controlled. Robbie Van Leeuwen, the band's founder and main songwriter, saw something familiar in her, not just in the sound, but in the way she seemed to command space without asking for it. He later said she reminded him of Grace Slick, not as an imitation, but as a presence. On paper, joining Shocking Blue made little sense. The band looked like a step sideways, maybe even backward. One failed album, no clear direction, but Van Leeuwen had ambition, and Mariska recognized something she understood very well, a desire to build something that did not yet exist. They were alike in that way. Both had drifted through projects. Both were tired of standing still. She agreed to join under one condition: no romance, No complications, only music. Van Leeuwen accepted. They did not waste time. With Mariska in the band, Shocking Blue suddenly sounded like something that had been waiting to happen. When they recorded At Home in 1969, the music carried a strange confidence. Dark guitar lines, Eastern colors, and in the center, Mariska's voice, steady, restrained, and impossible to ignore. It did not sound like a band searching for itself. It sounded like a band that had just found it. Some successes arrive gently, others fall like weather. Venus did not give Shocking Blue time to prepare. It simply happened. A simple melody, almost predatory in its movement, carried by a voice that cut through the song like a narrow beam of light. Mariska recorded it without visible emotion, her face calm, her posture almost distant. But inside there was a pressure, as if some part of her already understood that this song would not pass quietly. It didn't. The record moved faster than anyone involved could follow. It climbed charts, it crossed borders, it turned a Dutch band into an international name almost overnight. For the world, it was a moment of pure arrival. For Mariska, it was the end of something else. She had wanted success, she had wanted to escape the smallness of the local scene, but she never received a transition. One day she was a working musician, the next she was a symbol, a face, an image that no longer fully belonged to her. Behind the scenes she was still shy, still private. Her favorite backstage drink was tea, but the press did not care about that. They wanted mystery. They wanted projection. They wanted to turn her into something simpler than a person. She later said she began to feel like a doll. The expectations were immediate and endless. Interviews, tours, cameras, and the strange realization that the song which had opened every door was also beginning to close them. The success did not build her confidence. It quietly started to erode it. Fame had not arrived as a reward. It had arrived as a responsibility she had never been taught how to carry. Success did not stop the work. It only changed the air around it. In 1970, Shocking Blue released Scorpio's Dance, a record that moved away from the sharp impact of their breakthrough and into something more layered. Psychedelia, folk colors, Eastern motifs. The music breathed more. And so did Mariska's voice. It became softer, but also deeper, less interested in force and more in gravity. Songs like Send Me a Postcard and Mighty Joe proved the band was not a single moment frozen in time. They could evolve, they could explore, but the world was no longer listening in the same way. The shadow of Venus was long, and everything that followed had to live inside it. Touring became heavier. The rhythm of movement never stopped, and slowly Mariska began to retreat inward. Even as the stages grew larger, her private world grew smaller. Alcohol became a quiet way to soften the edges of days that no longer seemed to end. The next album was more mature, more carefully shaped around her voice. You can hear Van Leeuwen writing with her limits and her colors in mind. Never Marry a Railroad Man sounds less like a pop song and more like a conversation with fate, lush, restrained, and quietly resigned. But something else was happening at the same time. The band's center of gravity was shifting. Van Leeuwen began chasing the echo of their greatest success. Mariska, exhausted by the role she was supposed to play, began pulling away, not just from the public, but from the group itself. They were still moving forward, but no longer in the same direction. By the early 1970s, movement itself had become the problem. Albums continued to appear. Inkpot, Dream On Dreamer. On the surface, nothing was broken. Mariska's voice was still flawless, still precise, still capable of turning simple melodies into small emotional scenes. Songs like Out of Sight, Out of Mind and I Saw You in June proved that the gift had not disappeared. But the spark was quieter now. You can hear it in the recordings. Everything is correct, everything is in place, and yet something feels distant, as if the performances are happening behind glass. The tours never seemed to end. The rooms began to look the same. The days blurred together. Van Leeuwen was burning out in a different way. He had become convinced that the band had trapped itself inside its own greatest achievement, that no matter what they did, they would always be the group that made Venus. He wanted reinvention, a new beginning. Mariska wanted something much simpler. She wanted silence, rest, stillness, a life that did not require becoming someone else every night. These two desires could not exist in the same space, and slowly, without a dramatic argument or a final explosion, the band began to come apart. In 1975, Shocking Blue quietly dissolved. There were no grand farewell gestures, no final statement, just an ending. And for Mariska, for the first time in many years, there was nothing scheduled for tomorrow. For a while, Mariska simply disappeared. When she returned, it was not to reclaim a throne, but to stand somewhere smaller and more honest. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, nostalgia had begun to circle Shocking Blue's name, but the old intensity was gone, and that was a relief. Distance had taught her something she never had in her youth, how to protect herself from the noise. She came back through jazz. With the Mariska Veres Jazz Band, she found a different language, one built on standards, swing, and restraint. Her voice, once sharp like glass, had become deeper, warmer, and more patient. Critics said this was the singer she had always been, finally given room to exist. But the public had moved on. Timing once again was cruel. There were compromises, a return to Shocking Blue, nostalgia projects, records that belonged more to memory than to necessity. And then, at last, a true homecoming.
In 2003, she released Gypsy Heart, embracing the Hungarian and Romani roots she had carried quietly all her life. The album did not chase trends. It didn't need to. It sounded like acceptance. She performed with ease, with nothing left to prove. In 2006, illness arrived. Cancer moved quickly, and before the world could fully notice, she was gone. Mariska Veres did not win her greatest battle on a stage. She won it by surviving fame and finally learning how to live without it. Fame has a strange habit of rewriting lives into symbols. It turns people into moments, songs into shortcuts, and everything in between quietly disappears. Mariska Veres lived long enough to see that happen to herself. For most listeners, her story would always begin and end with a single melody. But that was never where her real journey took place. Her real work happened in the spaces no chart could measure. In the years of discipline before anyone was watching, in the slow withdrawal from a spotlight that asked more than it gave, and in the late return to a music that did not demand masks. She once carried a voice that sounded like distance itself, cold, controlled, unforgettable. In time, that voice changed. It grew darker, softer, more human, as if it had finally been allowed to belong to the person who owned it. She did not leave behind an empire. She did not build a legend in the modern sense. What she left behind was something quieter and rarer, the proof that it is possible to outgrow the story the world tells about you. Mariska Veres was not defined by her greatest success. She was defined by everything she became after it. And perhaps that is the only kind of victory that lasts.